This is the tragic story behind a $400 million fashion and beauty empire. And the way it collapsed is more painful than most people know. At the center is Eunice Walker Johnson. This woman built the most powerful black beauty brand in American history from a single charity show in New Orleans. Aretha Franklin wore her cosmetics in the ads. Diahann Carroll was her brand ambassador. The brightest stars in Black America stood on her stages at a time when the white fashion world would not even let them through the front door. For 5 decades, her empire clothed the dreams of a generation of black women. And then it sold for less than $2 million. What happened to Eunice Johnson's forgotten beauty dynasty? This is the story the fashion world never told. Chapter 1. Born in Selma, built in Chicago. Eunice Walker was born on April 4, 1916, in Selma, Alabama. And Selma in 1916 was not simply a city, it was a battleground. The Jim Crow South had spent decades making clear that black success was something to be punished, and her father, Nathaniel Walker, felt that pressure every day. He was a physician, a black man who had built something in a place that despised the idea of it, treating patients while navigating a system that viewed his very existence as a provocation. Her mother, Ethel, was a high school principal with authority the world around her refused to officially recognize. 2 black professionals building a life in a city that was still deciding whether black people deserved one. Eunice watched all of that and filed it deep inside herself, not as bitterness but as fuel. She armed herself the only way that mattered in Jim Crow, Alabama. A sociology degree from Talladega College in 1938, a master's degree in social work from Loyola University in Chicago. She was building a weapon before she fully understood what she was going to use it against. And in Chicago, in 1940, she met John H. Johnson, a young man with a vision for a magazine that would speak directly to Black Americans the way Reader's Digest spoke to everyone else. They married in 1941. Eunice helped stuff and stamp 20,000 envelopes to reach the first subscribers, and within a year the magazine had a circulation of 50,000 copies a month. When they launched a second title, she named it. She wanted something dark and beautiful and permanent. She called it Ebony. But the magazine was only the beginning. Because in 1958, a friend in New Orleans called with a simple request, and what Eunice did with that one phone call changed everything. Chapter 2. The one show that became everything. In 1958, a friend asked Eunice to help put together a charity fashion show for the Flint Goodrich Hospital at Dillard University in New Orleans. She agreed to help. She organized the models, selected the clothes, and produced a show that nobody expected to become anything more than that one night of fundraising. And then something happened in that auditorium that changed the direction of the next 50 years of her life. She looked at the audience. 300 people, black women and men dressed up for the occasion, responding to fashion with a hunger and appreciation that the mainstream industry had spent decades pretending did not exist. And Eunice understood at that moment that this was not just a charity event, it was proof of a market. So she did it again the following year. And then again, and the show grew every time. By 1961, she had taken full control as producer and director of what had become known as the Ebony Fashion Fair, and she transformed it into something the country had never seen before. The show traveled, visiting over 190 cities a year across the United States, Canada, and the Caribbean at its peak in 1991. It loaded the gowns, the models, the set pieces, and a 3-piece jazz ensemble onto a bus and took itself to black communities across the hemisphere, bringing with it something most of those audiences had never seen in person. Haute couture from the great houses of Paris and Milan, worn on the bodies of black women, on stages in their own cities. To stock the show, Eunice went to Paris every season and bought the clothes herself. She sat in the front row at Yves Saint Laurent, at Christian Dior, at Valentino, buying approximately 200 garments per season and spending an average of $1 million a year through the 1970s and 1990s. She purchased everything outright, with the understanding that these clothes would travel across America and be seen by audiences the European fashion world had never thought about serving. Getting into those showrooms was not always easy. In the early years, some of the Paris houses refused to see her, not because her money was not real, but because she was a black woman from Chicago and they could not imagine what she wanted with couture. She responded by collecting press clippings from every city the show visited, documenting the coverage their designs had received in audiences the designers had never reached, and then walking back into those showrooms and showing them the evidence. After that, the doors opened. Yves Saint Laurent became her favorite. She would run backstage to greet him after his shows. He invited her to his 40th birthday party. Over her lifetime, Eunice Johnson acquired more than 7,000 items of clothing and accessories, and her personal collection eventually became the subject of museum exhibitions at the Chicago History Museum and beyond. She had become, by the mid-1960s, one of the largest buyers of haute couture in the world, a distinction that almost nobody outside the fashion industry knew belonged to a black woman from Selma, Alabama, who had named Ebony magazine and helped stuff its first envelopes. Over its 51-year run, the Ebony Fashion Fair raised more than $55 million for African-American charities, including the United Negro College Fund and sickle cell anemia research, while introducing hundreds of thousands of people in cities across the hemisphere to the world of high fashion. But the show, as extraordinary as it was, turned out to be only half the story. Chapter 3: The Cosmetics Line That Made History. Every season, as Eunice's models prepared to take the stage in the gowns she had bought in Paris, they stood backstage in front of mirrors blending 5 or 6 different foundations together, trying to find something close to their actual skin tone. The major cosmetics companies did not make products for deeper skin. Not because the market did not exist, but because they had decided the market was not worth serving. Eunice went to those companies first. She approached several of the major cosmetics brands and asked them directly to develop products suited to the full range of skin tones that black women had. Every single one of them told her no. They were not interested in a market they had spent decades ignoring. She came back from those conversations, told her husband what had happened, and then they built it themselves. In 1973, Fashion Fair Cosmetics launched as the first prestige cosmetics line in America created specifically for women of color. It started with foundations, powders, and lipsticks in shades that had never appeared on department store counters before. The packaging was elegant, the colors were deep and specific to the skin tones that Eunice had spent years watching her models struggle to match, and it went into the best department stores in the country. Not drugstore chains, not discount retailers. Saks Fifth Avenue, Marshall Field's, Macy's, Bloomingdale's. Getting those stores to carry it was its own battle. Buyers at some of the most prestigious retailers in America had to be persuaded that their customer base would actually buy it. Eunice worked through every objection and placed Fashion Fair on counters in stores that had never considered dedicating shelf space to products designed with black women in mind. And then black women bought it, consistently and loyally, in the kinds of numbers that made the skeptical buyers look foolish for having hesitated. Diahann Carroll wore it in the ads. Aretha Franklin wore it. The faces the brand chose were not obscure. They were some of the most recognized black women in America, and seeing them associated with a product that was explicitly for women who looked like them sent a message that the mainstream beauty industry had never bothered to send. That message was that black women's skin tones were worth designing for, worth investing in, and worth celebrating. At its peak, Fashion Fair Cosmetics was sold in more than 1,500 department stores across America and internationally. It was the largest black-owned cosmetics company in the world. Eunice Johnson had built it because the industry told her it was not worth building. By 2003, the brand was doing $56 million in annual sales. The combined value of the Fashion Fair show, the cosmetics line, the Johnson Publishing headquarters on Michigan Avenue, and the broader enterprise was estimated at around $400 million. The woman who had started with a charity show in a New Orleans hospital had built an empire. But empires, as the Bronner brothers' story also showed, do not always survive the generation that inherits them. Chapter 4: The Years the Empire Started to Fracture. John H. Johnson died on August 8, 2005. For more than 6 decades, he and Eunice had built something together, and the company passed to their daughter, Linda Johnson Rice, who had been preparing for the role for years. Linda had traveled to the Paris buying seasons with her mother since childhood. She had been shaped inside the company. But the company she inherited was already under pressure that had been building for a long time, and that pressure was about to get much worse. The magazine industry that had made Johnson Publishing great was contracting fast. Print advertising was disappearing across the entire industry, and Ebony and Jet, which at their peak had been essential reading in black households across America, were watching their circulation numbers fall in ways that no editorial decision could reverse. The business model that had funded everything, including the fashion show and the cosmetics line, was eroding. Fashion Fair Cosmetics was facing its own separate crisis at the same time, and the two problems were feeding each other in ways that made both harder to solve. The world the cosmetics line had been built for no longer existed in the same form. In 1973, when Eunice launched the brand, the major cosmetics companies had refused to serve black women. By the 2000s, that was no longer their position. Revlon had launched a competing line. Avon had followed. Max Factor had entered the market. And then Rihanna's Fenty Beauty launched in 2017 with 40 foundation shades and redefined what inclusion in the beauty industry was supposed to look like. The market Eunice had created had become a market the entire industry wanted a piece of, and Fashion Fair had not evolved fast enough to compete. The inventory problems were the first visible sign that something was seriously wrong. Department stores that had carried Fashion Fair for decades began reporting that they could not keep the products in stock. Shelves that should have had foundation and lipstick in the full range of shades were frequently empty. Customers who had been loyal to the brand for 20 years showed up and could not find what they were looking for. And when they could not find it at Fashion Fair, they found it somewhere else and did not always come back. An empire built on the conviction that black women deserved access to beauty products that actually served their skin tones was being slowly defeated by its own inability to keep those products on the shelves. Eunice Johnson died on January 3, 2010, at the age of 93. The Ebony Fashion Fair had run its last show in 2009, ending a 51-year run. The woman who had built it was gone. The show was gone. And the company that remained was carrying a weight that was becoming impossible to hold. What came next was the part of the story that the family has described as the most painful chapter of all. Chapter 5. The Collapse and the Betrayal. After John Johnson died in 2005, Linda Rice had fought to keep the company together, and for years she managed it. She sold the Johnson Publishing headquarters at 820 South Michigan Avenue in 2010 for $8 million to keep things afloat. The building had been a symbol, one of the few downtown Chicago properties ever designed and built by a black company, and selling it felt like the beginning of a different kind of reckoning. The money bought time, but not enough of it. In 2016, Linda sold Ebony and Jet to a Texas private equity firm called Clearview Group. The magazines that Eunice had helped name, that she had written editorials for, that had been the foundation of everything the family had built, were gone from the family. Clearview did not manage them well. The freelancers who wrote for the new owners went unpaid for months and eventually sued, and the settlement was $80,000 split between 45 writers. That was what Ebony had become. In April 2019, Johnson Publishing Company filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The filing listed debts of more than $35 million. The company's most valuable remaining asset was its photo archive, more than 4 million photographs documenting 8 decades of Black American life. Those photographs sold at auction in the summer of 2019 for $30 million, purchased by foundations including the Getty Trust and the Ford Foundation. The pictures of Martin Luther King, Nat King Cole, and Aretha Franklin were now owned by institutions rather than the family that had taken them. Then, the collapse reached Fashion Fair Cosmetics at auction. This is where the story takes the turn that the family has called the deepest wound of everything that happened during those years. Desiree Rogers had served as CEO of Johnson Publishing from 2010 to 2017, hired by Linda to revive the struggling Fashion Fair brand. She had tried to bring in new colors and new marketing approaches, but the product line continued to struggle, and she had left the company in 2017. When Fashion Fair went to auction as part of the bankruptcy proceedings in November 2019, Linda and her daughter Alexa Rice believed there was an understanding between them and Rogers that neither of them would bid on the brand during the bankruptcy process. Rogers, along with former Johnson executive Cheryl Mayberry McKissick and a hedge fund called Magnetar, bought Fashion Fair at auction for $1,850,000. The brand that at its peak had done $56 million in annual sales sold for less than $2 million. And the family that had built it found out from someone else that it had been sold to the woman they believed had agreed not to bid on it. Alexa Rice said it was the biggest devastation and betrayal she had ever felt. Linda said people are going to do what they are going to do and there are things you cannot control. Rogers responded that Johnson Publishing no longer owned the company when the bid was placed and that she was committed to honoring the brand's roots. The brand Eunice had built because cosmetics companies told her black women were not worth serving had been purchased out of bankruptcy by the woman who had run the company that had failed to save it. What Eunice Johnson built over 50 years had been sold at a bankruptcy auction for less than $2 million. Not because the brand had no value, but because the company that owned it had run out of time, and the money had already gone to pay other debts. Chapter 6. What the Empire Looks Like Now. Rogers and McKissick relaunched Fashion Fair Cosmetics in September 2021 through Sephora. They rebuilt the product line from scratch with new formulas, vegan ingredients, and modern packaging in white and gold, replacing the pink compacts that Eunice had designed. By the time of the relaunch, Fashion Fair was carried in over 320 Sephora locations and nearly 100 Macy's stores across the country. The brand that had gone dark and nearly disappeared was back on shelves. Whether the new version can build the kind of loyalty the original earned over 30 years is something only time will answer. The Ebony Fashion Fair, the show that started everything, has not returned. The garments Eunice bought in Paris over 5 decades went to museum exhibitions and eventually to auction. A December 2019 sale offered hundreds of pieces from the collection, including Emmanuel Ungaro wedding dresses and decades of pieces from designers Eunice had fought her way into seeing. The clothes she had purchased to bring glamour to an audience the fashion world refused to serve were sold, piece by piece, to private collectors. Linda Johnson Rice remains the last direct link to the empire her parents built. Her daughter Alexa has started her own beauty brand, Beach Body, with 7 shades of lip gloss, carrying the same understanding her grandmother carried into every department store she persuaded to stock Fashion Fair. That black women deserve products made specifically for them. In 2024, Fashion Fair and Black Opal, the 2 brands Rogers and McKissick own, were named the official beauty sponsors of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, the same city where Eunice and John Johnson had built their empire decades earlier. It was a moment that carried a particular kind of weight. The brand Eunice had created in Chicago, in a building on Michigan Avenue that her daughter had eventually been forced to sell, was back in Chicago under different ownership. That is where the empire stands today. Chapter 7. What the family paid for the empire. The Eunice Johnson story does not end with the family holding everything that was built intact and passing it down whole. It ends in a bankruptcy court in Chicago in 2019, with a brand that changed the beauty industry selling for less than $2 million, and a family watching from the outside as someone else bought what their mother and grandmother had created. But before anything is said about the ending, the beginning deserves to be said plainly. Eunice Walker Johnson was born in Selma, Alabama in 1916 to a doctor and a school principal who refused to let a segregated system decide what their children could become. She went to college, earned a master's degree, married a man with a vision, helped him build a publishing empire, and then built her own version of one alongside it. She did all of that without anyone handing it to her, in a fashion industry that did not want her in its showrooms and a beauty industry that did not want to serve her customers. She spent 51 years producing the most important annual fashion event in Black American cultural life. She spent more than 30 years building a cosmetics line that told black women their skin tones were beautiful and worth serving. She spent $1 million a year buying Yves Saint Laurent and Christian Dior and Givenchy off the runway in Paris, and bringing them back to audiences in Birmingham and Detroit and Kingston, Jamaica, who would never have seen those clothes otherwise. She did it while raising children, writing editorials, running the financial operations of a publishing company, and eventually serving on the advisory board of the Harvard Business School. She ran the Ebony Fashion Fair for 51 years and barely gave a single interview about how hard it was. The exhaustion of constant travel, the battles with showrooms and department stores, the pressure of running an organization of that scale without the recognition that a man doing the same thing would have received, none of that made the front page while she was doing it. It made the front page only when it was gone. The empire she built absorbed losses that would have ended most companies. Her son, John Harold Johnson Jr., died in December 1981 at the age of 25 from sickle cell anemia, the same disease the Ebony Fashion Fair's charitable work had funded research into. She kept the show running within weeks of burying him, because that is what the company required, and that is who she was. When her husband died in 2005, she kept going. When her own health was failing in her final years, she kept going. The last Ebony Fashion Fair ran in 2009 when she was 93 years old and had about a year left to live. She ran that show for 51 years, and the year she could no longer run it was the year it stopped. What she left behind was a company that her daughter fought for years to save and eventually could not. The building was sold, the magazines were sold, the photo archive was sold, and the cosmetics line that Eunice had built specifically because the industry told her it would not serve black women was sold at a bankruptcy auction for $1,850,000. That number, set against the $56 million in annual sales the brand had done at its peak and the $400 million the empire had been worth at its height, tells the full weight of what was lost between the first charity show in New Orleans in 1958 and the final gavel in a Chicago courtroom in 2019. What Eunice proved still stands. Black women deserved access to beauty products made for them. A cosmetics line built for darker skin tones would find a loyal market. A woman from Selma, Alabama, with a sociology degree and a passion for fashion could walk into the Paris couture houses, write a check, and bring those clothes back to her people. All of that remains true. All of that was Eunice Johnson's work. And the story the fashion show stages never told about itself is the one you just heard. So, do you think Fashion Fair could have survived if the company had moved faster to modernize its products and packaging in the early 2000s? Or was the collapse of Johnson Publishing as a whole something that made saving Fashion Fair impossible, no matter what decisions Linda made? We would love to hear your thoughts. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to Black Status for more. See you in the next video.